The fluorescent glow of a fast food sign buzzed against the pitch-black backdrop of a November evening in 1983. Inside the warmth of the restaurant, a family of three squeezed into a vinyl booth, surrounded by the comforting aroma of baking dough and bubbling mozzarella. It was the quintessential American Friday night. But for the father sitting at the table, the grease-smeared glass of the window offered a view into a much darker world. What he witnessed that night would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks ever established on U.S. soil. This narrative isn't just about espionage, it's about how a mundane family outing transformed into a high-stakes race to prevent classified nuclear protocols from vanishing behind the Iron Curtain. By the time the check is paid, you will have to wonder, would you have made the same choice? Special Agent James Mitchell was a veteran of the Bureau, having served for 14 years. His domain was counterintelligence, a shadow world where he tracked the movements of foreign operatives. Soviet tradecraft wasn't just his job, it was the puzzle he spent every waking moment trying to solve. However, this particular evening came with a strict condition. He had sworn to his wife, Catherine, and their energetic 8-year-old, David, that the badge was left at the door. Tonight was strictly about quality time. Tonight was dedicated to deep dish pizza. The Mitchell station wagon pulled into the crowded lot on Riverside Drive at precisely 6:45. Little David had his nose pressed against the cold glass of the backseat window, fogging it up with excitement as soon as the iconic red roof came into view. Catherine shot James a glance as they unbuckled, a silent, stern reminder of his vow to be present. James returned the look with a reassuring smile. There would be no shop talk, no mentions of dead drops or double agents. Just a regular father enjoying the start of the weekend. The establishment was humming with activity. Most of the red upholstery booths were filled with local families, their collective chatter creating a white noise of suburban safety. A jukebox in the corner spun a popular rock and roll track, competing with the clatter of silverware. James held the heavy glass door for his family, receiving a warm welcome from the shift manager, George, who had become accustomed to seeing the Mitchells during their Friday ritual. They were guided to an open table situated right next to the front plate glass window. David didn't even need to open the laminated menu. He knew exactly what he wanted, a personal pan pizza, pepperoni, with extra cheese. Catherine chuckled at the boy's unwavering consistency. For the first time in a month, James felt his shoulders drop an inch. The knots of stress in his neck began to loosen. Perhaps, for just an hour, he could shed the skin of the spy hunter and simply exist as a husband and dad, far away from the geopolitical chess match of the Cold War. Their server, a teenager named Brenda, scribbled down their requests. A large Supreme for the parents to split, the boys' personal pizza, and a round of sodas. As Brenda marched toward the kitchen, James leaned back against the vinyl seat. His eyes, acting on a decade of muscle memory, drifted toward the glass to scan the exterior. It was a habit ingrained in his DNA, a switch he couldn't flip off. Constant vigilance. The parking lot looked entirely standard for a Friday rush. Headlights swept across the asphalt as sedans and wagons jockeyed for position near the strip mall's storefronts. The neighboring dry cleaner was flipping its sign to "closed," while the pharmacy lights still burned bright. It was a tableau of safe, small-town America. David was launching into a story about his science class, describing a papier-mâché volcano with animated hand gestures. Catherine leaned in, offering him her full attention, asking follow-up questions to keep his excitement going. James nodded along, feigning engagement, but his peripheral vision had locked onto movement outside. It wasn't that he wanted to look, it was that he couldn't help it. After 14 years of tracking GRU officers who blended effortlessly into American crowds, his brain was wired to notice anomalies. And that is exactly when the first car caught his eye. A dark blue Chevrolet Impala entered the lot, moving with a deliberate slowness. Instead of pulling into an empty spot near the door, the driver reversed into a stall at the far perimeter of the lot. Backing in wasn't a crime, but the angle was specific. It provided the driver with a panoramic command of the lot and a straight shot to both exit lanes. James's pizza hit the table, steam rising from the crust, but his appetite had vanished. His attention was now bolted to the dark asphalt outside. Catherine said his name twice, her voice blending with the background noise, before he finally snapped back to reality. He muttered a quick apology, blaming fatigue from the office, but his internal alarm bells were deafening. Something was off. 5 minutes later, the second piece of the puzzle rolled in. A burgundy Ford Ltd., showing its age with patches of rust, entered the scene. It moved with extreme caution, creeping along the lane before pulling into the slot directly adjacent to the blue Chevrolet. The positioning was surgical. The Ford's driver's side window lined up perfectly with the Chevy's passenger side glass. James watched, frozen, as the engines cut. Neither driver opened a door. Neither man stepped out to grab dinner. They just sat there, two silhouettes in the dark, ignoring the bright lights of the Pizza Hut and every other shop in the plaza. Catherine noticed the shift in his demeanor immediately. To a casual observer, the scene playing out on the other side of the glass was mundane, perhaps two drivers discussing directions or a minor fender bender. She touched his arm, asking if everything was all right, her voice tinged with concern. Jim answered in the affirmative, but his body language betrayed him. His slice of pizza remained untouched on the plate, his jaw set like stone. The interaction between the two vehicles was a masterclass in clandestine signaling. Even separated by 50 yards of asphalt and plate glass, the dynamic was unmistakable to a trained eye like Jim's. The drivers were clearly conversing, yet their heads remained rigidly facing forward. Their lips moved in sync, but their eyes scanned the horizon, never once meeting each other's gaze. This was textbook surveillance detection. The conversation, disjointed and distant, persisted for several tense minutes. Then, the dynamic shifted abruptly. The driver of the Chevrolet lowered his hand beneath the door frame, out of sight. When it reappeared, his hand gripped a manila envelope, bulky, substantial, the kind used for files that shouldn't exist. In a fluid motion taking less than 2 seconds, the package crossed the gap into the Ford. Jim's mind began to sprint through the Rolodex of possibilities. Innocence was a possibility, perhaps a loan repayment between friends or a business contract being signed on the fly. But the context screamed otherwise. The calculated positioning of the cars, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, the hyper-awareness of their surroundings, it all pointed toward a clandestine dead drop or a live intelligence exchange. The blue Chevrolet didn't linger after the handoff. The engine turned over, and the car eased out of the spot with practiced caution, turning right onto the main road and vanishing into the southern night. The Ford, however, remained frozen in place. The driver sat motionless, the illicit package now likely resting on the passenger seat. He was waiting, checking his mirrors, ensuring the coast was clear. Jim stood up abruptly. He told his family he needed to make a call. He strode to the payphone located near the restrooms, the smell of industrial disinfectant mixing with the scent of pepperoni. He fed a quarter into the slot and dialed. Frank Matthews, his partner at the field office, answered on the second ring. Frank was a fixture at the office, a man who lived for the job and was always working late. Jim relayed the license plates and descriptions in hushed, urgent tones. The Chevy had diplomatic plates registered to the Russian embassy. The name attached to the vehicle was Yuri Fedorov. Officially, he was listed as a cultural attaché. Unofficially, the Bureau knew him as a KGB operative suspected of running assets in the capital. The Ford was still a mystery, its Virginia plates running through the slow gears of the system. The reality of the situation crashed down on the family dinner. Jim returned to the booth, but the evening was effectively over. He instructed Catherine to take David and head home immediately. She saw the intensity in his gaze and didn't argue, masking her worry for the boy's sake. Jim walked them to the car, standing as a silent sentry until their taillights faded, before returning to his post near the restaurant entrance. He didn't go back inside the warmth of the Pizza Hut. Instead, Jim loitered by the door, lighting a cigarette he didn't really want. It was a prop, a reason to be standing still in a parking lot at night without drawing attention. He watched the burgundy Ford through the drifting smoke. 15 minutes had passed since the Chevy left. The KGB standard for clearing a drop site was 20 to 30 minutes. The driver was disciplined. Relief arrived in the form of a nondescript dark green sedan rolling into the lot. It parked 3 spots away from the Ford. 2 agents sat inside, invisible to the untrained eye. Moments later, a second bureau vehicle took up a position near the entrance. The trap was set. 4 federal agents were now locking down the perimeter, ready to tail the suspect the moment he decided to move. The Ford's engine finally rumbled to life. But instead of exiting onto the main road as any normal patron would, the driver pulled a classic counter-surveillance maneuver. He swung the car around the back of the strip mall, accessing a service road that fed into a maze of residential streets. The green sedan pursued, but they were seconds too late. By the time they rounded the corner, the Ford had evaporated into the night. Frank arrived on the scene moments later, frustration etched on his face. However, the news regarding the Ford's owner provided a critical breakthrough. The car belonged to Stephen Irving, a resident of Arlington. On the surface, Irving was a ghost, no criminal record, clean credit history. He was employed as a procurement specialist for Horizon Systems, a major defense contractor working on sensitive projects. But a deeper dive into Irving's background revealed a crack in the facade of the perfect suburban employee. While his security clearance was active and his record spotless, his financials told a different story. Over the last 12 months, Irving had made a series of cash deposits, $3,000 here, $5,000 there. It wasn't a fortune, but for a salaried procurement officer, it was an anomaly that demanded an explanation. On Monday morning, the fluorescent lights of the FBI field office hummed over a critical strategy session. Jim and Frank sat across from Director Charles Webb, laying out the fragmented mosaic of evidence they had assembled over the weekend. The connection was circumstantial but damning, a defense contractor employee with unexplained cash influxes interacting with a known KGB officer. Director Webb, a man who had seen his fair share of Cold War paranoia, listened with a stoic intensity. He understood the gravity of the implication immediately. If Irving was selling specs on electronic warfare systems, the United States was effectively handing its aerial superiority over to the Soviet Union. He didn't hesitate, authorizing a full-spectrum surveillance package. The machinery of the federal government began to turn with silent precision. Teams were assembled to initiate physical surveillance that would cover Irving 24 hours a day. Warrants were signed to tap his home telephone lines and bug his office at Horizon Systems. A forensic financial audit was launched to trace every cent that had passed through Irving's hands in the last decade. The physical surveillance began that very afternoon. It was a grueling, unglamorous task. Agents rotated in shifts, sitting in hot cars, drinking lukewarm coffee, and watching a man live a painfully ordinary life. For the first 72 hours, Irving was the picture of suburban banality, commuting, grocery shopping, and tending to his lawn. But on Thursday evening, the pattern broke. Instead of turning into his driveway after work, Irving navigated his sedan to a public library in Alexandria. The surveillance team felt the electric jolt of a potential break. He parked and entered the building, carrying a briefcase. One undercover agent followed him inside, grabbing a newspaper as a prop to blend in. From behind the pages of the Daily News, the agent watched Irving at the photocopiers. He wasn't copying recipes or tax forms. He spent 30 minutes duplicating a stack of technical documents. The agent couldn't get close enough to read the headers without burning his cover, but the intent was clear. Irving was moving data away from the secure environment of his office to a public space where his actions left no digital footprint. This was a specific breed of tradecraft designed to defeat internal security audits. By using a public machine, Irving ensured that Horizon Systems' own logs would never show unauthorized copying. Jim and Frank analyzed the report that night. The conclusion was inescapable. Irving had received his instructions or payment in the parking lot, and now he was preparing the merchandise for delivery. Over the next week, the surveillance net revealed a sophisticated communication system. Irving wasn't just meeting people randomly, he was using signal sites. Agents documented him leaving subtle, almost invisible markers in public places, a white chalk mark on a specific blue mailbox, a thumbtack pressed into a wooden utility pole at a busy intersection. These were the silent screams of the spy world. A mark meant, "I have information," or "I am ready to meet." The absence of a mark meant, "Hold position." The FBI photographed every instance, logging the time and location, waiting for the other half of the equation to appear. It was a game of patience, a high-stakes fishing expedition where the bait was treason. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon. A vehicle matching the diplomatic Chevrolet from the Pizza Hut incident rolled slowly past one of the marked signal sites. High-speed photography confirmed the driver was Yuri Fedorov. He didn't stop, didn't brake, just offered a fleeting glance at the chalk mark Irving had left the night before. The connection was confirmed. The signal had been received. The response was immediate. 24 hours after the drive-by, Irving left his office at Horizon Systems early, telling his supervisor he had an urgent dental appointment. But there was no dentist in his future. He drove straight to a sprawling shopping mall in Fairfax, a temple of 1980s consumerism filled with neon lights and wandering shoppers. He parked his car and entered the mall, but he didn't shop. For an hour, he was a ghost in the machine, drifting aimlessly from store to store, pausing to look at window displays but never buying a thing. It was a classic, cleaning route, designed to bore any potential tails or force them to reveal themselves by lingering too long. Eventually, Irving made his way to the food court, the chaotic heart of the mall. The smell of fried food and sugar hung heavy in the air. He purchased a black coffee and claimed a table right in the center of the seating area, exposed on all sides. He opened a newspaper, creating a wall between himself and the world. The FBI team was already embedded. Agents posed as couples eating burgers, as janitors sweeping floors, as shoppers resting their feet. Jim was among them, his eyes scanning the periphery. Then, he saw him. Yuri Fedorov entered from the north entrance, moving with the casual confidence of a man who owned the place. Fedorov didn't acknowledge Irving. He didn't even look in his direction. He went to a separate food counter, bought a drink, and sat at a table 3 rows away. He placed a folded magazine on the table. To the hundreds of civilians eating their lunch, they were just 2 strangers. To Jim, the tension was suffocating. The air felt charged with static. After 10 minutes, Irving stood up. He folded his newspaper under his arm and began walking toward the public restrooms. His path took him directly past Fedorov's table. As he neared the Russian, Irving stumbled. It was a clumsy, uncoordinated trip, his foot seemingly catching on a chair leg. The newspaper slipped from his grip and hit the tiled floor. Fedorov reacted instantly, playing the role of the helpful stranger. He bent down, retrieving the fallen paper. For a split second, both men were crouched together. In that brief window, obscured by the table and their own bodies, the swap occurred. When they stood up, Fedorov was holding the newspaper, and Irving was nodding his thanks. It was a brush pass, executed with surgical precision in under 3 seconds. Irving continued to the restroom, empty-handed. Fedorov sat back down, the newspaper, now heavy with stolen secrets, resting innocently next to his magazine. Jim watched it happen, his knuckles white. He had just witnessed a felony in real time. The FBI command team faced a critical decision point. They could swarm the food court, guns drawn, and arrest both men. They had the probable cause. But Director Webb held the line. He needed to know the scope. If they arrested them now, they stopped the leak, but they wouldn't know how deep the water was. Fedorov finished his drink and left the mall, carrying the newspaper. Agents tailed him all the way back to the district. They watched helplessly as he drove through the iron gates of the Soviet embassy. The documents were gone. They were now on sovereign Soviet soil, beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. Jim felt a pit in his stomach. They had let the secrets go to catch the traitor. For 2 weeks, the Bureau meticulously gathered the strings of the operation, preparing to pull the knot tight. They documented 3 subsequent exchanges, each a carbon copy of the food court handoff. They pinpointed the exact classified files Irving had accessed on the secure terminals at work. The evidence was no longer a trickle, it was a flood. On a gray Wednesday morning, the endgame began. As Stephen Irving swiped his badge to enter the Horizon Systems building, he was met not by his colleagues, but by a team of federal agents. He was placed under arrest quietly and efficiently. At the exact same moment, tactical teams breached his suburban home, executing a comprehensive search warrant that would strip his life bare. The search validated every suspicion Jim had harbored since that night at the pizza parlor. Concealed behind a false wall in the basement closet, agents discovered a fully equipped espionage toolkit. There was a copy stand with high-intensity lights, specialized macro lenses for document photography, and one-time pads for encryption. They also found the price of treason. Stashed in vacuum-sealed bags inside the wall insulation was $60,000 in used bills. When confronted with the physical evidence, Irving's facade crumbled into silence. He invoked his right to counsel immediately, realizing the game was over. But the Bureau didn't need his confession, the physical evidence spoke volumes. The trial was a slow burn of legal maneuvering. Irving's defense team attempted to paint the surveillance logs as circumstantial, arguing that meeting a diplomat was not a crime. However, the jury saw through the smoke. The forensic trail of money, the specialized camera gear, and the recovered classified documents formed an unbreakable chain of guilt. Stephen Irving was found guilty on all counts of espionage. The judge, recognizing the severity of the betrayal, handed down a sentence of 30 years in a federal penitentiary. His life as a suburban dad was over, traded for a few envelopes of cash and a prison cell. The fate of Yuri Fedorov was starkly different, a reminder of the uneven rules of the Cold War. Protected by the diplomatic immunity of his cover identity, he could not be prosecuted. He was declared persona non grata by the State Department and given 48 hours to leave the country. He flew back to Moscow, likely to a hero's welcome and a medal for his successes, despite the burned network. The damage assessment conducted by the Pentagon was sobering. Analysts concluded that Irving had been leaking data for a minimum of 3 years. The compromised schematics detailed the electronic countermeasures used by U.S. fighter jets. To mitigate the loss, the military would have to spend millions redesigning the systems to ensure American pilots remained safe. For Special Agent Jim Mitchell, the conviction was the capstone of a long career in the shadows. He received official commendations and a plaque for his wall. But the accolades mattered less than the internal quiet of a job well done. He had stood on the wall and done his duty. One evening, years later, Catherine asked him the question that had lingered between them. Did he regret ruining that night? Did he wish he had just eaten his pizza and ignored the cars in the lot? Jim took a long time to answer. Finally, he told her that looking away wasn't an option. It wasn't just his job, it was his nature. In a world where adversaries work tirelessly in the dark to undermine your way of life, someone has to be willing to stand watch. David, who had never quite forgiven the loss of his ice cream that night, eventually grew old enough to understand the trade. The resentment faded, replaced by a quiet pride in knowing his father was a silent guardian. The Cold War dragged on for another decade, a silent struggle fought in back alleys and boardrooms. It wasn't won by armies clashing on a battlefield, but by the accumulation of small victories, by the patience of surveillance teams and the sharp instincts of agents who refused to switch off their awareness. Jim retired in 1995, watching the world change as the Soviet Union dissolved into history. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought the spotlight on cable news. He simply went home to his wife, content in the anonymity of his service. Yet, old habits are the hardest to break. Even in retirement, whenever Jim drove past a strip mall at dusk, his eyes would instinctively sweep the parking lot. He knew that the game never truly ends. Somewhere, in another town, in another era, another handler is passing an envelope, and another spy is selling secrets. Which brings us back to the question at the heart of this story. If you had been sitting in that booth on a cold November night, focused on your family and your meal, would you have seen it? Would you have noticed the car backing in, the stiff posture, the lack of eye contact? It is easy to believe we would be vigilant. But when the comfort of a normal life is right in front of you, calling for your attention, would you have made the call? Would you have chosen the cold reality of duty over the warmth of dinner? Take a moment to consider that. And if you have an appetite for more true stories about the invisible wars fought in our own backyards, make sure to subscribe. History is filled with ordinary people who noticed the extraordinary and chose to act. Until next time, keep your eyes open.